Hi, everyone, and welcome to GLF Live. My name is Gabrielle Lipton, and I'm the editor of Landscape News for the Global Landscapes Forum. Today, we're here to break down one of the most complex and often controversial global forestry programs to see what it has actually achieved. The name of this program, which many of you might be familiar with, is Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation in Developing Countries, which has been running for more than a decade now, commonly known by its acronym REDD+. Its design, in short, sets a framework for richer countries to pay developing countries for keeping their forests intact, as many developing countries, especially in the tropics, hold some of the most carbon-rich, climate-crucial forests that we have. Of course, there have been many triumphs and pitfalls in such a program as REDD+, and there have been numerous scientific reports put out in recent years examining them. One of the most recent and important of these is one released earlier this month by the International Union of Forest Research Organizations entitled Over a Decade of REDD+ Outcomes and Sociological Impacts. In light of this report's release, we at the Global Landscapes Forum, together with the International Union, have put together this amazing panel of speakers here to share about the report's findings and REDD+ in general from different viewpoints. From academia, we have Bhaskar Vira, head of the Department of Geography and a professor and fellow at the University of Cambridge. From the implementation side of REDD+, we have Natalia Nascimento, a geographer and researcher currently studying the intersection of policy and land use dynamics in Latin America and the Caribbean. And from decision-making, we have Dirk Niemetz, team lead of the Agriculture, Forestry, and Land Use Unit at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. So welcome to our speakers. We're so happy to have you here today. And we're just going to dive right in to what this report has to say. So Bhaskar, I'll start with you. In a few words, judging by this report and your own learnings over time, what can you tell us that REDD+ has achieved so far, and how relevant is this program still?
Thank you, Gabrielle, and thank you for the invitation to contribute to this panel. So just to respond, I think it's really important for us to set context, especially in light of the recent 6th IPCC report. And it's important to recognize that REDD+ is only a partial solution towards the climate change problem. Given the magnitude and scale of the main sources of emissions, forests are only one part of the solution, and we shouldn't lead people to believe that we can solve the problem through forest and land use change. Keeping that in mind, we should now look at what the evidence was and what we were able to assess in the report. And it is clear that forests and actions under REDD+ have a significant potential of contributing to greenhouse gas emission reductions. The difficulty we have is that programs under REDD+ are at a relatively early stage of implementation. And to draw firm conclusions regarding impacts is really difficult, even at this stage. Despite these limitations, we have tried to draw on the indirect evidence which is available. So what the report suggests is that this indirect evidence shows that, for example, deforestation is declining more rapidly in REDD+ countries than in eligible countries which have not adopted REDD+. So you can draw some indirect conclusions about the potential impacts that REDD+ might be having. We also conclude that the integration of REDD+ interventions with national development strategies and plans makes it more likely that lasting changes can be implemented, which will avoid risks of leakage, which will secure things like additionality of actions under REDD+. And that's really important, that we're not simply displacing activity from one area to another. So some of the indirect evidence on the direct carbon outcomes suggests that there is potential and there is evidence that actually there is achievement. But of course, REDD+ also was accompanied by social and environmental safeguards. So what we were also reviewing is what is the evidence that in the delivery of those carbon benefits, there were no adverse impacts on social and environmental concerns. And again, reviewing the evidence is difficult because there is limited direct monitoring of REDD+ impacts on social and environmental outcomes, but we can attribute some information from available studies. There's a lot of case study material which we have drawn on in the report. And here the evidence suggests that the impacts on biodiversity as well as on livelihoods and other economic and social outcomes, are quite uneven and very context dependent, especially because of the limitations around monitoring of these outcomes. But again, where the evidence is strong, what it suggests is that community engagement really matters. The involvement of local stakeholders in decision-making really matters. Explicit attention to rights and tenure issues in the implementation of REDD+ helps to secure the long-lasting success of the program. So I'll stop at that point because it's a long report and I would recommend that colleagues take the chance to look at the detail, but just a few high-level messages from the report.
Thank you so much. And my colleague is going to be dropping that report in the chat so people who are listening can immediately take a look at what that report says. But thank you for that overview. And it's great to hear that deforestation has been going down in REDD+ countries. And interesting about the specific context of biodiversity and livelihoods, which hopefully we'll get to dig into a bit more in this conversation. But I'm going to turn to Dirk now. Because Dirk, you're on the decision-making side and the rule-making side of programs such as these. And how has what you've just heard Bhaskar said and some of the findings about REDD+ stacked up against what its designers intended for it to achieve?
Well, thank you. It's a very complex question. I mean, I think the first time it was clear that there's a problem with tropical deforestation was more in the 1970s. And I remember publications on tropical forest action plans in the 80s. And in 2005, the idea was born in one of the UNFCCC conferences to say, okay, let's connect these. Let's try to incentivize stopping deforestation because of the emissions coming with deforestation. And let's start a program that puts incentives that will stop deforestation. I think the idea was very good and it was very sincere and there was a lot of political pressure behind it. But from today's point of view, it was also slightly naive in how easy it would be. It's like, we want to go to the moon, let's build a rocket, fly and be on the moon. And people realized that just throwing money at deforestation will not stop it, even if you combine different aspects, if you combine livelihoods, sustainable development goals. At that time, they were called differently, but same concept, combine biodiversity goals, land degradation goals, and climate goals, and then you should very quickly get there. But you have to see that this is all happening in a landscape that already exists, and people are living there, people are using the forest, people are having their livelihoods depending on that. There is market pressures on commodities that are needed and that lead to deforestation in some areas. And also, I mean, 2005 was a very different time from today. There were extreme technical limitations with measuring what is actually the outcome of what is happening. What REDD+ has, and it took a long time for countries to agree on what REDD+ should be. And the final agreement, I would say, was in 2013 with the Warsaw Framework on REDD+. And this was also directly incorporated into the Paris Agreement. So there was clear commitment that parties want this to have be one of the future legs of climate change. And it's very clear also from the IPCC report published earlier this year on climate impacts on forests, that this will not be possible if the emissions continue to rise in energy, in industry, in transport, etc., because of the impact the rising climate has on forests. We could just lose forests because of that, even if our governance was perfect of the forest itself. So it really is just one block, and I thank Bhaskar for that comment in addressing climate change. But it can be a very important block, and it can be a block, as we've also seen in many studies in the last years, with a lot of co-benefits and a lot of benefits for local communities and also for other environmental services. What was really achieved since 2013 then, and also in some countries that started earlier before that, is to build the capacity, build the institutions. And some of this has been made easier by progress that was made in satellite imagery and the possibility to do remote sensing of forests and know a lot better, not perfectly well, but a lot better than 10 years ago, what's going on in the forests, having more real-time, more small-scale data and being able to observe this very quickly. What is then still needed, and I think some countries are much more advanced than others, is to have institutions that can react to that can assess where are the drivers of deforestation, and that can then improve the forest management, can directly address the drivers, and also to build the capacity and keep it in the country, to have someone who is permanently looking at the issue of forest governance in the context of climate change, but not only climate change, and streamline this climate change policy into the forest governance with the data, with the decision making, and with the land use planning happening in the country at the same time. And there a lot has been achieved, and I think many countries are on a very good progress, but there has also been very clear understanding in REDD+ at all times that we're not starting all at the same level. Some countries have 200 years of data from forest inventories and forest research, and some countries don't have it. So some countries are well advanced in that progress, and some are behind. And I think it was very important to get all countries on board so that we don't have this effect of leakage that Bhaskar also mentioned, that we protect forests in one area where the governance is good, and the deforestation increases in another one where it's lagging behind. And I think there's also good progress in that, as we have, I think, about 60 tropical forest countries that are actively engaging with the convention on implementing REDD+ and looking into how this can play an important role for the country in implementing the Paris Agreement as well.
Thank you, Dirk. It's great to hear that so many countries are on board, and yeah, indeed, a lot of overlap with what you have to say, what Bhaskar has told us before around climate change, getting that into forest management, forest policy more and more as the climate continues to change, and also these difficulties around measuring, around monitoring, but hopefully with the advancing of satellite imagery and satellite data, that can feed into that as well. Natalia, we're going to move to you now. You've been working and researching on the ground in Brazil, across Latin America and the Caribbean for quite some time now. How have you seen REDD+ change the landscape of Brazil, the landscapes you've been working in? How have you seen it impact the ground level?
Thank you for the question, Gabrielle. I think that is a very important question considering the current situation of deforestation in the Amazon. So first of all, I'd like to say that my expertise is the human dimension of land use change. So Professor Vera and Professor Nemitz, please feel free to complement my answer with technical information about REDD+ if you feel it's necessary. So regarding your question, Gabrielle, I think that is very important to be in mind that REDD+ is a very important instrument to help to curb deforestation. However, it is only a part of the solution. That is, REDD+ alone, without a political, economical, and social structure to support it, will not work properly. Also, I think that is important to consider different moments of deforestation in the Amazon when we talk about REDD+. When REDD+ began to be implemented in the Brazilian Amazon, the Brazilian government was investing intensively to combating deforestation in the region through the creation of new protected areas, improve the monitor and inspection of deforestation. Thus, REDD+ emerged as a complement to these actions, as an economic alternative to conserve the forest and help the people that are living in the forest. So, however, for years of all deforestation that happened in the Amazon, only 8% occurred in the protected areas, including those that are engaged in REDD+ projects. So since 2013, annual deforestation rates in the Amazon have become unstable. And since 2019, we have surpassed the 10,000 square kilometers mark of deforestation. So we are living in a bad moment of deforestation in the Amazon. So in these 3 last years, the percentage of deforestation in protected areas has gradually increased. Today, we have around 12% of all deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon happens in protected area, especially those that are in agricultural frontiers areas, and includes some that are included in REDD+ projects. So it's a reflection of the bad moment for deforestation, influence the REDD+ projects as well. So in the stakeholders consultation that I carried out for this report in the Brazilian Amazon, although this bad moment, this bad scenario, what I could see is that there is an effort for subnational governments from the Amazon to strengthen REDD+ initiatives. I have also seen a huge effort from the local communities on the ground of these projects, working daily to conserve the forest while facing several threats, such as invasion of their lands, illegal exploitation of natural resources through the illegal mining, illegal logging, and criminal wildfires. So in brief, I think that REDD+ is a very good instrument to help to curb deforestation in Brazilian Amazon, that over time contributed a lot for the forest conservation in many regions of the Brazilian Amazon. However, this mechanism, like all the mechanisms today, also needs a urgent and strong commitment from the government, political structure to support this mechanism to curb deforestation and allow that REDD+ and others can have a strong impact on deforestation.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us a bit of a context, regionalized view of what's happening with this program as well. And that's really important to see it that way. And I want to ask you a follow-up question branching off of that, which was also a finding of the report, which is that REDD+ is more successful when its implementation becomes more localized and context specific, which Bhaskar touched on at the beginning, and what you're kind of touching on now, describing some of these communities that are environmental defenders facing threats and whatnot. So could you tell us a bit about what that might look like, what this finding of that it needs to become more localized and context specific, how would that look on the ground in different communities?
So I think that the implementation of REDD+ initiatives following regional particularities is of paramount importance, because tropical regions have a great diversity of vegetations, histories, and drivers of land use change. In Brazil, we have this high diversity of histories, drivers of land use change as well. So similarly, governments live different political, economic, social, cultural contexts and could have different technical capacities to monitor and manage their forests. So these aspects can be decisive in the way of governments deal with deforestation and forest degradation, and consequently how they approach REDD+. Today, national and subnational governments have some flexibility to adopt different approaches to REDD+. For example, whether they will focus on the carbon stock conservation or in the sustainable forest management and forest carbon stock enhancement, on how methodology will be adopted in different data to define the forest reference emission levels, and how that is the gross emission of deforestation, emissions from deforestation, forest degradation. So logically, this should follow some criteria predetermined by a framework that imposes some requirements for calculation, reporting these metrics, verification, the monitoring of forestry, and how these calculations are related to the national GHG inventories submitted to UNFCCC. In the chapter 2 of the report, with which Professor Vira contributed, bring 3 case studies from Brazil, Ghana, and Indonesia that clearly point out how these countries determine different REDD+ strategies following different trajectories because the national and subnational political, economic, and social context. So how these different scenarios contributed or not to the advancement of REDD+ and to curb deforestation in these countries. In Brazil, you have what I could see in the stakeholders consultation, that you have a great difference in different national landscapes. For example, today, the design of REDD+, the strategies of REDD+, are based on the Amazon reality. So all metrics, all strategies are more focused on conservation. However, we have other biomes with a great threat of deforestation. For example, Atlantic forests today have alone around 10% of the forest remaining. Cerrado, that is in the center of Brazil, has only 50% of this forest remaining, and a very pressure from the monocultures, especially soybean. So we have a demand for different modalities of REDD+ today in Brazil to have a broad engagement of the country as a whole. So I think that design strategy for a country for Brazil is a huge challenge because the heterogeneities of people, landscapes, and laws that you have. But I think that considering these national and subnational specificities is crucial not only to guarantee the functioning of REDD+, but also for REDD+ evolution as a concept.
Thank you, Natalia, for that sweeping answer, and also raising these different biomes aside from just the Amazon, which is super important. Bhaskar, we'll move back to you now. There have been innumerable reports on REDD+. It has been highly studied. What did this report that IUPRO has just put out find that differs or reaffirms from the findings of other reports in the past? In other words, what are some of the key points of scientific consensus and difference on REDD+, and what do you make of that?
Thanks, Gabrielle. I'll start with the points of consensus. I think there's been, Dirk has already mentioned this, there's been a huge emphasis on issues around monitoring, reporting, and verification over a long period of time. So the literature is full of people agreeing on the importance of this, as well as recognizing the discrepancies in both capacity and quality of data, and the need for better integration so that we can actually make sense of what's happening. So, I would say that one of the kind of big remaining biophysical challenges, even though there's consensus around this, is that we need to improve the quality of our monitoring processes and make them more harmonized in some senses. I think the other point that Dirk made in his opening remark was that there is consensus on this point, that just throwing money at the problem isn't going to solve global deforestation. So I think it's a much more complex question than that. There are people who've been studying forest histories for decades now, and trying to understand that within political, social contexts is really important. On REDD+, again, there's consensus that non-carbon benefits are a vital part. So the whole beauty of the program was the plus part of REDD+, that unless we pay attention to the non-carbon benefits, we're not going to realize the full potential. And again, I would say that there's a growing scientific consensus around that as a kind of insight. And then finally, one of the points that I emphasized, I think those who've been studying it from a governance and social perspective have converged upon the recognition of the importance of tenure, rights, and local participation as critical ingredients in success. I think there's study after study which reaffirms that. So I think those would be points where I would say there's kind of a growing consensus. What did the report do different? So, the report is obviously designed as a review of existing studies. We were not trying to do new research. But there were some areas of our emphasis that I think differs from where the emphasis has been in the past. And I just wanted to pick out maybe three. One was work which I guess I was personally involved with, which is to review the role of finance increasingly as an actor in the processes of REDD+ governance. So there is increasing interest in large-scale financial investments around REDD+. And that's creating a much more complex financial landscape, which goes outside of the traditional donor-based landscape. You're getting increasing interest in private actors who are contributing large-scale finance into these mechanisms. And finance is taking on particular roles as a tool of governance. So we review that carefully, and we talk about the kind of complexity that's created in an already complex governance landscape. But finance obviously comes with the power of imposing conditional requirements as part of the conditions attached with the disbursement of real money. So I think that's creating a new set of actors and a new set of governance dynamics. And we spend quite a lot of time in one of our chapters talking about that. I think the other thing is the increasing role of new technologies. I think the ability of new technologies to provide better and higher resolution data, but also for us to use things like artificial intelligence and machine learning to actually train our systems better to try and understand what those patterns might be. I think that's something which is a great potential for the future. And I think the final thing I would point to is the report spends a lot of time talking about linking REDD+ to other initiatives. So there are parallel initiatives. People are talking about nature-based solutions. People are talking about forest and landscape restoration. Now, these are, of course, for this GLF audience, very familiar because, obviously we are talking about a number of parallel interventions that affect the ways in which we interact with the land resources that we are dependent upon. Now, the report talks about the need for integration. It talks about the risks of confusion, especially for the stakeholders that Natalia has been talking about. You have this proliferation of initiatives under different labels, and they have different ways of impacting the lives of local communities. And we spend a lot of time sort of talking about the importance of streamlining those interventions in order to avoid that design confusion.
Thank you. Thank you so much for pulling out a few of the areas of consensus around monitoring, reporting, verification, that throwing money at the problem doesn't solve deforestation, the non-carbon benefits, and the role of tenure and rights, which is indeed increasing on the international agenda, which is great, and some of the differences around finance as an actor, stressing the role of new technologies, and then linking REDD+ with other initiatives. Thank you for that great summary. And we're going to pull out now the financial aspect that you were just talking about and put this to Dirk. So what do you see, Dirk, working and not working in the financial design of REDD+? So channeling money to developing countries who are reducing their deforestation. What's working, what's not?
Thank you. That's another good question. And of course, while we say money alone will not solve the problem, it will need money to solve the problem in the end. Without resources, it will be extremely difficult. What we could see over the years is a lot of commitment from multilateral and bilateral donors, and also from other actors, including private sector, to find innovative solutions on how to finance the deforestation part, or how to finance the turning the tide on deforestation, but also finding regulatory ways to be responsible for supply chains. How can we create deforestation-free supply chains has become a very important thing for many large private sector actors. We can also see that parties received a lot of help in building their institutions. There's free satellite imagery available thanks to donors that countries can just use as soon as they have the capacity. There's capacity building ongoing where countries can learn how to make use of all of these free resources. And what I think is also working well is the recognition that no one source of finance will be enough to fund the end of deforestation. And there's really a diversity of funding combined, from direct donor funding to bilateral funding and multilateral funding, private sector getting engaged, private sector trying to create deforestation-free supply chains and address this directly in the countries. Also, the idea of voluntary or compliance carbon markets is coming up, how this can maybe contribute to the finance needed. And also the Green Climate Fund had a large pilot program to provide results-based payments, which has been seen as very important in the developing world. So all of this, I think, is signals in the right direction. What we're not really seeing is a combination of different finance streams as strongly. What I mean with that is forests play a big role in biodiversity. They play a big role in adaptation. But it has been much more complicated for countries to combine these into the same area where funding is already received for REDD+ from different actors. So recognizing that maybe what has been playing around for $5 a ton per CO2 emission reduction, or now in some initiatives $10 per ton, may not be sufficient to counter the incentives from big commodities like palm oil or cattle ranching, and that maybe a combination of different streams are needed, and finding innovative ways where how countries and also local actors can do this without being receiving complaints that they are combining or double selling what they're having in different initiatives. I think that's an important part. These combinations have to happen for countries, also in line with the national planning and national priorities, both in national climate plans, but also adaptation plans, biodiversity plans, etc. All of this can link easily together, especially in forests. It's an area that is really prevalent to do this. The second part is that what we see in many, many countries is REDD+ doesn't implement itself. There's a lot of support, but the country also needs to put forward resources. There must be local staff. There must be people that know the ground. There must be people that keep the institutional memory and that build the capacity over time, and then build up on not only the capacity to do measuring and monitoring, not only the capacity to do land use planning, but also for accessing finance. It's a very specific capacity the countries need. And building this requires some sort of predictability of what to get out. If a forest administration goes to their head of state and say, look, we need a certain amount of money, so we get something out of REDD, and there are similar requests from a health education, initiative, education initiative, food security initiative, it's very difficult to make the case when there's no predictability in the finance that comes out of this investment. I think that's also something where finance for REDD+ could be doing better and needs to be doing better if we want to achieve zero deforestation by 2030, as countries pledged in Glasgow at COP26.
Thank you, Dirk. Many good points there about combining different finance streams and, yes, building capacity, including that people who know how to access finance and maintain that over long periods of time. So I would like to take this moment before we move into kind of the last part of this panel discussion, that to those of you who are listening on our different platforms, if you have any questions for our speakers, please drop them in the chats. We'll reserve a few minutes at the end for those, and I'll also weave them in as we go into these final few questions. And we have one now that I think perfectly dovetails off the topic that we're talking about now. And this is a question that we've gotten from our YouTube channel, and I'll put this to you, Natalia. How can we make sure that communities in charge of protecting forests are receiving funding?
Hi, this is a very good question, but a very complex question. So I'm going to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about the stakeholders consultation carried out for this report, which may bring some answers. So the stakeholders consultation took place in 12 countries from Latin America and Asia, and involving more than 200 stakeholders. So interesting fact is that in different parts of the world, some issues and challenges related to REDD+ projects emerged in a very similar way. And the problem with the resource distribution was one of them. So I think that each country can develop different solutions based on its demands, in some cases, for example, tenure rights is a priority. In other cases, fighting corruption is more important now. And in other places, reduction of REDD plus implementation costs is crucial. So I will base my answer on the impression of the more than 40 Brazilian stakeholders who evaluated the IUF report and try to answer this question. So for some actors on the ground in REDD Plus projects in the Amazon, Brazilian Amazon, there is a large gap in the transparency in the distribution of resources. In some cases, local communities don't know exactly how much some private companies that manage projects receive from the REDD Plus market, and how much of this amount is transferred onto the community. So it's important to emphasize that this occurs in some cases, and you have very good examples of REDD Plus in the Brazilian Amazon. But unfortunately, some information, communication, and transparency gaps happen in some projects. So another aspect is related to the lack of participation of civil society and representatives of the local communities involved in REDD Plus projects in decision-making process. This is particularly important in REDD Plus strategies definition, because listen to these people in this moment is crucial, because they are the ones who determine whether a project will work or if the country will achieve the goals, its goals. So one of the main lessons brought out in the IUF report states that local indigenous people and local communities, when placed at the center of the REDD Plus projects, the project achieved core benefits beyond the goals, beyond the carbon sequestration, carbon stock, but can contribute to restoration of biodiversity and to food security. I think that is a good way to improve the quality of life of these people involved in REDD Plus project. So I believe that in Brazil, in the Amazon, there is a particular reality. I believe that the guarantee of effective participation, and I say effective in the sense that these people will have their voice heard and the word will impact commitments. So effective participation of these people, the transparency and autonomy of the goals and resources related to REDD Plus is crucial, is a start to improve fair transfer of resources to the actors that are on the ground of the REDD Plus project. So I know that this strategy can differ according to reality of challenge of each country. So I think there is autonomy, transparency, and participation. A fair participation is a good start to guarantee a fair distribution of resources to the communities on the ground.
Thank you for stressing that. Autonomy, transparency, and fair participation. We'll keep that in mind. Dirk, we'll go back to you. Working at the international policy level and through your work with UNFCCC, what is needed at that level to overcome some of the challenges that we've discussed in this conversation about REDD Plus?
Thanks for that question. I mean, one is necessarily on the international level, we're not so much looking at the project level. And for us, really, the projects are more demonstration activities, and what counts is what happens on the country as a whole. And of course, if what needs to happen, but maybe this is more on a national level, is to properly embed the projects into a national strategy. And I think there is a level of recognition, especially since many people that have been dealing with REDD in the early days are retired or moved on, to really recognize that the Warsaw Framework for REDD Plus is a holistic framework that can really provide the framing for everything we're doing. And it's not a standalone thing. It has to have supporting structures around, from finance, from national strategies, etc. But the framework itself is very flexible and very strong and can allow for all of these things to happen. And what I mean, for example, is that in some areas, there's a focus on, for example, uncertainties, which would help to, if uncertainties are lowered to a certain level, to have more acceptance of deforestation credits in the carbon market. At the same time, the effect of that is that REDD Plus is not one activity, it's not two activities, it's 5 activities. It also is about sustainable forest management, enhancing forest carbon stocks, and the conservation of forest carbon stocks. And in these areas, it's very difficult to achieve such uncertainties. And I think there must be a growing recognition that they also have very important contributions to make to the reducing emissions or enhancing removals from land and forests, and that they also need their incentive levels that need to be recognized. There's also, of course, there's the national strategy country has to put together, as mentioned before, but there's also the safeguards part, which would be very difficult to negotiate something like this again. So I think it's very important to build on that and use the Cancun safeguards, as they're called, as a baseline, and build them up based on the national circumstances and where the country already stands and where they started. And I think the beauty of this is that over time, all of this, the improved data and the improved implementation, can link to the GHG inventory of the country, where greenhouse gas emissions are reported on the national level throughout all sectors, but then also to the Paris Agreement goals. And the same data can also be used for goals beyond that. So I think the recognition of the framework as a framework which can be filled with life according to national circumstances and according to where finance is coming from and what are the actual threats of deforestation. I think that's something that could be well benefit from strengthening over the next few years and achieving then our 2030 targets and beyond.
Thank you, Dirk. We have one question from the audience that, if you don't mind, I'll put to you now before we go to our last question for Bhaskar. But earlier in the conversation, you mentioned deforestation-free supply chains. And we have a question coming in from Facebook asking, is there a way to increase the productivity of forests while also preserving them? And I'm wondering if you might like to say a few words on that question now. I know this is another complex.
There is a way, and I'm, as a forester myself, I would always say that it comes back to forest governance with using adaptive management based on sound data. And these are the pillars that are the same wherever I go, whether I go to a very dry forest in Southern Africa, whether I go to Siberia, where there are only a few trees per square kilometer, or whether I go to a very dense tropical rainforest in lowland Costa Rica. These principles are always the same. You must know what's going on in the forest. You need to be able to adapt your management, also depending on local circumstances and communities and how to get them on board. And then you need the governance to actually implement this. These 3 pillars stay the same.
Thank you so much. So the governance and management based on sound data. And now, Bhaskar, we'll move to you for the final wrap-up question here, which is, what are you and other researchers going to be examining most on REDD+ in the years to come?
So, Gabrielle, one of the well, thank you for that. And one of the very attractive parts of working in this area is that it's such a truly interdisciplinary field. I mean, there's just so many questions that people can ask. And of course, I come at this from my own particular perspective. I'm an economist with a sort of strong interest in understanding the political economy questions around land use and forest management. But I will try and represent the sort of broader community and of scientists who are working in this field, both from the natural and the social sciences. And there's so many questions that people are, wanting to work on. So I'll just pick out a few, but I apologize if I miss out on particular areas, because there are just so many things that people can think about. So I think we've talked a little bit about the need for improved monitoring and verification. And I think there's a real excitement around big data, remote sensing, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and the convergence of those in terms of trying to improve the quality of our reporting and monitoring around land use change and forest change. So I think there's a kind of really interesting convergence of those who've been working on ground-based ecological monitoring, but combining that with remote sensed and data from remote sources, and trying to make a much stronger emphasis on some of those technologies. So I think there's a real kind of opportunity here, and I know a lot of colleagues in both ecology and in computer sciences and in other fields are really working to converge there. And I think some of the largest corporations are also beginning to converge in this area. So people like Google and others are bringing their AI intelligence into this area. So I think there's a real opportunity there within sort of the technological and ecological sciences. I think that's coupled with a lot of work which is going on within the sort of biological and biodiversity sectors, and especially with this convergence with nature-based solutions. So I think people are trying to understand how different interventions are leading to different types of impacts in terms of positive and negative impacts on biodiversity. So where are the convergences there? And again, ecological monitoring and reporting is really important, particularly large-scale quantified studies, which can show the impacts of REDD+ through experimental approaches, through trials, to really understand how these things are working on the ground. I'd couple that with people who are beginning to get really interested in using the same types of large-scale randomized trials in terms of understanding the experimental outcomes on the human side as well. I mean, at some senses where implementation has taken place, you actually do have the opportunity to see what has the impact been, but the importance of doing that over long periods of time, because what you want is a permanence of human response as well. Just like you want a permanence of forest response, you want to make sure that the incentives work in a way that sustain themselves over time, that people don't go back into behaviors that might have previously contributed to deforestation or forest loss. So some of these studies have been very short term, and I think the interest now is to try and construct them so that they're longitudinal and demonstrate the behaviors sustaining over time. And then, of course, there are some remaining fascinating questions around the political economy and governance sides, the roles of finance, the roles of local incentives, the ways in which integration can take place across different sectors. So there's plenty to keep the political scientists, the sociologists, and the political economists busy for a long time. So I think there's a lot that we can all continue to do in this field.
Thank you. Yes, I think there's plenty to keep everyone busy for a long time, from the social side to the financial side to the scientific side to now the technological side. There are just so many aspects to REDD+ and all that it encompasses and tries to achieve. And I know this conversation has been very wide-reaching and we've touched on a lot of topics very quickly, but thank you all for giving us insight into your own unique perspective and experience with REDD+. It was informative to me. I hope it was informative to our listeners as well. And again, to everyone listening and to everyone who will listen back, I really encourage you to check out the IUFRA report. It's very well put together, very easily digestible, and makes some really good points on REDD+. So to all of our speakers, thank you so much for joining us. This was such a pleasure and such a great dialogue. And to everyone listening, thank you for your time. And we will see you next time on GLF Live. Thank you everyone so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.